Hello everyone and welcome to our voiceover presentation on comparative differences between China and South Korea as it relates to media censorship. China has a unique perspective and set of objectives on how to handle the flow of media and its consumption by its citizens. It is our understanding that South Korea has a more westernized approach to this topic than China, and that this would be a great opportunity to learn more about the two. My fellow group member Emily interviewed her cousin who actually lives in China for this project.
Hi, Emily here. So I did have the opportunity to interview my cousin who lives in Shenyang, China, and is currently an English teacher at a private after-school program, ISS Shenyang. In the interview, we spoke about how the website traffic is managed, and my cousin had mentioned China doesn't allow sites like Facebook, but they have Chinese versions that can be monitored by the government. Most people get around this by using VPNs, which is a service that says you are logging in from another country. It's interesting because I think the government knows a lot of its people use VPN, but they only seem to really crack down about twice a year. It's weird here because when something political happens, almost every Chinese person has the same view. A year or two ago, there was a water territory dispute, and almost all of our staff was posting the same pro-China article.
Did your cousin talk at all about how the views break up between people on this?
Yes, actually she had said, and I quote, "I just think the interesting part is that most people only have a one-sided view, and that's based on what they've heard. If China did something wrong to another country or to Chinese people, it's super difficult to get information on it, and usually around the date of big events, VPN is almost impossible to use."
It is interesting because it's my understanding that the Korean political realm has a more diverse offering on opinion. In addition to that, many of these accepted and different opinions are welcomed in South Korea on the most popular social networking site, Facebook.
Interesting point. Based on my understanding, I would agree. It is very ironic that Facebook is the most popular social site in South Korea, but not accessible in China at all. My teammate Rachel actually has an interesting research point that she was able to pull in.
Thanks, Emily, for the introduction. As Emily had mentioned, I read through some academic research on culture and censorship in China. Interestingly enough, I found an article that speaks about video game regulation, a topic that is broadly discussed in many nations today, including even the most westernized. The hypotheses researchers tested were as follows. Hypothesis 1. Perceived antisocial game effects on others will be greater than perceived antisocial game effects on the self. And hypothesis number 2, the strength of third-person perceptions will be greater for antisocial game effects than for pro-social game effects. Researchers found mass media may elicit a stronger influence at the societal level, whereas personal level influence is engendered by interpersonal communication. Hence, the less specifically others are described, the more judgments on a societal level will be made. This quote speaks directly to the strong-willed perception that aspects in Chinese media, like violent video games, need to be regulated. News sources in China have been openly criticizing video games for, quote, mindless or excessively violent behavior, validating this acceptance to act these out in real life. One might wonder, well, why does a nation do this? What might their objectives be? Bryce, you also had an interesting academic site as it relates to the strategies surrounding censorship in China, correct?
Thanks, Rachel, and yes, I do. I read an article entitled China's Strategic Censorship by Peter Lordson. The article focused on why they do and censor what they do. As it was stated in the source, Peter uses the example media control is not simply an interesting facet of authoritarian politics. It is fundamental to determining whether such regimes survive or fall. While conventional wisdom takes for granted that authoritarian regimes will always strive to minimize independent reporting, this assumption deserves more scrutiny. Using a formal model, this article has shown how an authoritarian regime can benefit from a more sophisticated media control strategy, permitting journalists to report aggressively on low-level malfeasance. In order to improve governance, but constantly adjusting the amount of reporting in order to avoid giving discontented citizens enough information to be certain about whether a revolt would receive sufficient support to be worthwhile. So in other words, the media in China is a good tool for smoking out and removing corruption from government without bringing attention to other high-strung issues that could lead to public unrest. Blake, we have been talking a bit about China now, and their strategy. What are some of the things that you have found in your side research on what the major strategy is in South Korea, if there is one at all?
Thanks, Bryce. Yes, I actually spoke with my TA from South Korea on this stuff. Now, although their freedom of speech is respected, public libraries are somewhat of an exception. Public libraries in South Korea actually have certain topics that are censored, much like in the US. The only difference is that not only are the topics like sexuality censored, but even educational information about sexuality is censored. South Korea does pride themselves on the freedom of the press. The one major thing explicitly stated, though, and this may be one for interpretation by the power that be, is the option of the law to limit the expression of ideas that praise or incite the activities of anti-state individuals or groups. This seems to be because of their strict policy on enforcing the minimization of ideas that could spread to some form of extremism. Ultimately, we found many differences between the two countries. Ireland, are there any things that I missed or anything you want to highlight as major takeaways from our comparison?
Well, Blake, I think the big takeaway being from America is how many similarities we see with South Korea, and maybe how many differences there are with China. Before this project, I had no idea that Facebook wasn't accessible or that aspects like that were so different among Asian cultures. I also took the time to look at the Press Freedom Index, which is an annual ranking of countries compiled and published by Reporters Without Borders. This metric talks about the degree of freedom that news journalists and others involved in the media have relative to their peers in other countries. The scores are pretty straightforward, where having a lower score is better. Norway, for instance, has the number 1 spot with a score of 7.6, whereas South Korea's neighbors to the north are ranked at 180 with one of the worst ratings with a score of 84.98. South Korea has a ranking of 63 and a score of 27.6. China has a ranking of 176 with a score of 77.66. I think the big takeaway is that the political spectrum ultimately has the most pull in deciding censorship. South Korea has a democratic republic with a 3-branch form of government with checks and balances. China has a communist rule, which focuses on a complete political authority approach. These different approaches and their impacts on culture and perception have massive implications, not just for them, but for the world. The success or failure of a regime, or even just a major policy, can have rippling effects throughout other countries and their governments.
Well, there you have it. Hopefully this informational comparison between China and a more westernized Asian nation, South Korea, on how they handle media was helpful and interesting. The next time you play your game, watch your show, or visit Facebook, maybe consider the implications, or lack thereof, of your access and consumption of media.